something that keeps swirling around in so many discussions is the link, or, well, the perceived link between transgenderism and mental health. It can feel like navigating a minefield, really. Lots of opinions, and often, frankly, just a lot of confusion.
Yeah, absolutely. It gets heated.
So let's try and cut through the noise today. We're taking a deep dive into a pretty fundamental question. Is transgenderism itself inherently a mental health issue?
And to get to the heart of that, we'll be drawing on the material you've gathered, this really comprehensive set of sources we have here.
Right.
Our aim isn't really to advocate for a particular stance, but to truly dissect the core arguments, understand the historical context that's really shaped this whole discussion, and look squarely at what the evidence actually suggests.
Exactly. Think of this as your shortcut to clarity. We've done the heavy lifting, sifting through the complexities to bring you the crucial insights, the pieces of the puzzle that can help you form your own understanding without feeling buried under, like, an avalanche of information.
Hopefully.
Okay, so where should we even begin to unpack this? It feels big.
I think the history of how medical frameworks have viewed transgender identities is a really important starting point.
Ah, okay.
It kind of sets the stage for why this question is even being asked,
Right. Because it wasn't always seen as just another way of being human. Our sources show that way back 1952, with the first edition of the DSM, terms like transvestism started to appear, and then that sort of evolved into gender identity disorder later on.
Yes, exactly. And by the time DSM-3 came out in 1980, gender identity disorder was a formal diagnosis.
Okay.
And the criteria really focused on this persistent desire to live as the opposite gender. And significantly, this was often associated with marked distress.
Which, when you look back now, it really seems to reflect the limited understanding of gender diversity at the time, doesn't it?
It really does.
It's almost like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Our sources make a really compelling parallel to how homosexuality was also pathologized.
Yes.
As a mental disorder until, 1973.
That's such a crucial point of comparison. It really illustrates how, historically, anything that deviated significantly from the prevailing norms, around gender and sexuality, was often framed as some form of pathology. Now, it's important to say the initial inclusion of these terms in the DSM wasn't necessarily driven by, malice.
Right.
But it definitely reflected an attempt to categorize and explain phenomena that challenged the dominant binary view of gender.
But, as we now understand, those classifications had very real and very harmful consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
The idea that transgenderism was a disorder unfortunately provided a kind of pseudo-medical justification for things like conversion therapy, which, as our sources emphasize, aimed to cure someone's gender identity and, just caused immense psychological damage.
Precisely. That pathologization fueled stigma. It fueled the notion that transgender individuals were somehow inherently flawed or disordered.
Yeah.
It's just vital to remember that this historical framing of transgenderism as a mental health issue was largely rooted in the prevailing cultural biases of the time.
Right.
Rather than, objective scientific evidence.
Which brings us to a really critical distinction highlighted in our material. The difference between transgender identity itself and gender dysphoria.
Yes.
These are two distinct concepts, aren't they?
Absolutely distinct. And this is where so much of the confusion arises, I think. Gender dysphoria, as it's defined in the DSM-5 back in 2013, is a specific clinical diagnosis.
Okay.
It refers to the distress, the significant distress a person experiences as a result of that mismatch between their gender identity and the sex they were assigned at birth.
So it's specifically about the distress, the discomfort that arises from that mismatch.
Exactly.
Our sources list symptoms like intense discomfort with one's body, a strong desire to be recognized as a different gender, or feeling significant anxiety about physical characteristics, things like that.
Exactly. And the crucial point to grasp here is that not all transgender individuals experience gender dysphoria. And conversely, not everyone who experiences dysphoria necessarily identifies as transgender in a binary way. Some individuals identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming.
That's a really key takeaway. So, according to our sources, the American Psychiatric Association's current stance is that being transgender in itself is a normal variation of human experience,
Right.
not a psychological disorder.
Precisely. The shift in the DSM from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria was a very deliberate move.
Ah.
It was aimed at destigmatizing the experience of being transgender by focusing on the potential distress some individuals might feel rather than pathologizing their core identity.
So it makes space for support without labeling the identity itself as the problem.
Exactly. This allows for the recognition that while being transgender isn't a disorder, some transgender people do require medical support for dysphoria, like hormone therapy or surgery.
But then our sources present a counter-argument, don't they? If gender dysphoria has a psychological basis, this feeling of disconnect, mind and body, doesn't that kind of inherently suggest a psychological underpinning to transgender identity itself?
Well, this is a really central point of debate, and those who argue for a significant psychological component often point to research, like that 2016 meta-analysis in the Lancet Psychiatry. It did find higher rates of psychiatric disorders, things like depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation among transgender individuals compared to the general population.
And the interpretation there is that this higher prevalence suggests something more than just societal factors at play, like something inherent.
Yes, that's the argument, that this data indicates maybe a deeper psychological component that might suggest viewing transgenderism through, well, a mental health lens.
Oh.
However, it's really crucial to consider alternative explanations for these elevated rates of mental health challenges,
Right.
which our sources definitely explore next.
Which is the significant role of societal stigma. I mean, it makes intuitive sense, doesn't it?
Totally.
If you're constantly facing prejudice and a lack of acceptance, that's bound to have a profound impact on your mental well-being.
Absolutely. The minority stress model offers a really valuable framework for understanding this.
Okay.
It basically posits that marginalized groups experience chronic stress just from societal rejection and discrimination. And this chronic stress leads directly to negative mental health outcomes.
And our sources provide some quite compelling evidence for this. That 2015 study in the Journal of Counseling Psychology, for example, found a direct correlation between higher levels of discrimination, things like, losing your job or experiencing harassment, and poorer mental health outcomes for transgender individuals, depression, suicide attempts.
And when we look at the lived experiences of transgender youth, the impact of stigma becomes even starker, really.
Yeah.
The Trevor Project's 2022 survey reveals some really concerning statistics, like 60% of transgender and non-binary youth reporting discrimination because of their gender identity.
60%.
And a staggering 43% seriously considering suicide. It's heartbreaking.
God, that's awful. But
Yeah.
then you see the profound impact of the opposite, right? The power of acceptance.
Yes.
That same Trevor Project survey found that young people who had supportive families, families who, respected their pronouns, affirmed their identity, they had a 50% lower rate of suicide attempts.
50%, that's huge.
That's a massive difference.
Yeah.
That's not about inherent pathology. That seems clearly about the life-saving power of acceptance.
It really underscores the protective effect of affirmation and support. It's undeniable.
Yeah.
However, as our sources rightly point out, some argue that while stigma undoubtedly exacerbates mental health issues, it might not fully account for the observed prevalence of psychiatric conditions.
How so?
Well, for instance, the 2018 JMA surgery study found that even after undergoing gender-affirming surgery, transgender individuals still had a higher rate of mental health treatment compared to cisgender individuals.
Huh. That's a really interesting and honestly somewhat surprising finding.
It is.
It prompts the question of whether maybe dysphoria persists for some, even after medical transition, or if there might be other underlying psychological vulnerabilities at play.
Exactly.
That statistic almost makes you wonder if we're sometimes focusing too much on the medical transition without fully addressing maybe deeper underlying issues.
Precisely. And the sources also note that some critics feel the minority stress model, while really important, might oversimplify what is likely a very complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors. It's probably not just one thing.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've explored the historical context, the huge impact of societal stigma. Let's turn to the fundamental question of the science behind gender identity itself.
Right.
What do we currently understand, or perhaps more accurately, what don't we fully understand about why someone identifies as transgender?
Yeah, this is where the research is actively evolving. And, well, while we're gaining insights, definitive answers remain pretty elusive.
Okay.
Current research suggests that gender identity is likely shaped by a complex interplay of biological, neurological, and potentially environmental factors. It's multifactorial.
Our sources mention brain imaging studies. What kind of findings have emerged from that area? Is there anything concrete there?
Well, some studies, including that 2018 meta-analysis in Nature, have indicated that, on average, transgender individuals show some brain structures and patterns of activity that seem to align more closely with their identified gender than with the sex they were assigned at birth.
Really? Like what?
For example, transgender women have sometimes been found to have regions in the hypothalamus that are more similar in size and function to those of cisgender women than cisgender men.
Hmm. That certainly seems to point towards a biological basis for gender identity.
It does lend support to that idea, yeah. There's also the hypothesis concerning hormonal influences during fetal development.
Okay.
The 2019 endocrinology study our sources reference suggests that maybe atypical exposure to sex hormones in the womb could potentially influence the development of gender identity later in life.
So the emerging scientific picture seems to be leaning towards perhaps a biological basis for being transgender, rather than it being solely a matter of psychological choice or social influence.
That seems to be the direction much of the research is currently pointing, yeah. It suggests that transgender identity isn't simply a feeling or a preference, but may have deeper biological roots.
But it sounds like there are caveats.
Oh, definitely. It's really important to acknowledge the limitations of this research. As our sources point out, brain imaging studies often involve relatively small sample sizes and sometimes yield inconsistent results. And the hormonal theories, they're still largely in the realm of hypothesis. We need more data.
And the counterargument often raises that these observed neurological differences could potentially be a consequence of living as a particular gender, right?
Exactly.
Or maybe even a result of the chronic stress associated with gender dysphoria, rather than a primary cause of transgender identity itself.
That's precisely the critique. Or social conditioning could play a role. The fact that there isn't yet a definitive, universally accepted biological marker for transgenderism is often highlighted by skeptics,
Right.
leading some to continue to view it primarily through a psychological lens.
Now, our sources also detail a really significant shift in perspective within the kind of mainstream medical community regarding transgender identity. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, there's been a really notable evolution in how major medical and psychological organizations are approaching transgenderism. A pivotal moment was the World Health Organization's revision of the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, ICD-11, in 2019.
Yeah, what happened there?
They reclassified gender incongruence from a mental health disorder to a condition related to sexual health.
And the core reasoning behind that was to explicitly recognize that being transgender is not inherently a sign of mental illness.
Precisely. And the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, and the AMA, the American Medical Association, have also issued affirming statements. They recognize transgenderism as a normal variation of human diversity and state that gender-affirming care can be effective in alleviating the distress associated with gender dysphoria.
What are the intended benefits of this big shift in how these major organizations view transgender identity?
Well, the primary goals are really to reduce the pervasive stigma associated with being transgender,
Make a sense.
to improve access to necessary medical and mental health care without the implication of a primary mental disorder, and also to facilitate insurance coverage for gender-affirming treatments.
Right.
Our sources mention a 2020 study in pediatrics that found a significantly lower rate of psychological distress in transgender youth who had access to puberty blockers.
That's another really compelling piece of evidence highlighting the positive impact of timely support. But this shift in the medical community, it hasn't been universally welcomed, has it?
No, definitely not.
There have been criticisms and concerns raised.
No, it hasn't. Some critics argue that this reclassification might be driven more by social and political considerations than by a solid scientific consensus. And there are also legitimate concerns being raised about the potential for the rapid adoption of affirmative care models without perhaps a thorough enough exploration of potential underlying psychological issues in some individuals.
And our sources touch on that 2021 British Journal of Psychiatry study, the one that highlighted cases of what's been termed rapid onset gender dysphoria.
Yes.
Yeah.
That study suggested that social or psychological factors might indeed play a more significant role in some individuals presenting with gender dysphoria, particularly, it seemed, in adolescence.
Right.
That study and the whole concept of ROGD, it raises important questions about the diverse pathways through which someone might experience gender dysphoria and really the necessity for careful and nuanced assessment.
Which naturally leads us to the topic of gender-affirming care itself. Interventions like hormone therapy, surgical procedures, social transition.
Hmm.
While often presented as the most effective approach for alleviating gender dysphoria, is it always the complete answer?
Well, it's certainly the model of care that is often considered the gold standard. And a substantial body of research does indicate that these interventions can significantly alleviate gender dysphoria
Yeah.
and lead to improvements in mental health outcomes for many transgender individuals. For example, that 2018 study in The Lancet found a significant reduction in psychological distress and a lower rate of suicide attempts after gender-affirming surgery.
That sounds very positive.
It is.
But our sources also point out that the efficacy isn't absolute, right? It's not a universal solution for everyone.
That's correct.
Some individuals continue to experience mental health challenges even after these interventions.
That's correct. The 2022 study in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, for instance, indicated that a notable percentage, maybe 10 to 15% of post-surgery transgender individuals still reported experiencing ongoing mental health issues.
10 to 15%.
And the well-publicized case of detransitioners like Kira Bell in the UK has really amplified concerns about the potential for rushing into irreversible medical treatments without comprehensive psychological evaluation and support.
It really raises the important question of whether, maybe in some instances, gender-affirming care might be primarily addressing the symptoms of a deeper underlying mental health issue rather than the root cause of the distress.
Exactly. That's the heart of the concern for some. The 2019 study in psychological medicine found that a significant majority, around 70% of those seeking gender-affirming care, also had co-occurring psychiatric conditions.
70%? Wow.
Yeah. Which strongly underscores the importance of providing comprehensive mental health support alongside any medical interventions.
Right.
There's a real tension here between viewing transgenderism primarily as a medical condition requiring affirmation and treatment, and seeing it as a more complex psychological experience that might benefit from deeper exploration in some cases.
And all of these individual and medical experiences are unfolding within a very specific and often challenging social and cultural landscape, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely.
The levels of stigma and discrimination that transgender individuals continue to face daily, they're still incredibly high.
They are. The societal stigma is a pervasive and significant factor. As our sources detail, transgender people experience discrimination in just numerous areas of life.
Yeah.
From seeking employment and healthcare to simply trying to use public restrooms safely. That statistic from the Williams Institute estimating 70% of transgender Americans experiencing harassment or denial of services is truly sobering.
70%.
Yeah.
And it's not just overt acts of discrimination, is it? The often negative and stereotypical portrayals in the media that contributes too.
Absolutely. That can contribute to a climate of misunderstanding and further marginalization. And as our sources point out, this persistent stigma has tangible negative consequences for mental health.
Like what?
Well, that 2020 study in social science and medicine linked the implementation of anti-transgender policies in certain states directly to higher rates of mental health-related hospitalizations among transgender individuals.
Wow. So policy has a direct impact.
A direct, measurable impact.
Yeah.
But then we also see the powerful protective influence of positive social connections and representation.
Right. The flip side.
Exactly. Our sources mention that 2019 study in the Journal of Community Psychology, which found a link between involvement in transgender advocacy groups and affirming religious communities with higher levels of life satisfaction.
That really highlights the vital role of community and acceptance in promoting well-being. It sounds crucial.
It is. However, some critics do argue that the strong emphasis on affirmation within some of these spaces can, perhaps inadvertently, discourage open and critical discussion about the psychological dimensions of gender identity.
Now so.
Well, the concern is that sometimes any questioning or skepticism might get labeled as transphobic, potentially stifling important research and dialogue. It's a delicate balance.
I see. Our sources also thoughtfully include some case studies to ground this often abstract debate in real human experiences.
Yeah, those are helpful.
The examples of Jazz Jennings and Chloe Cole offer such distinct and important perspectives.
They really do. Jazz's openness about her own experiences with depression and anxiety, even while living authentically as a transgender woman with strong family support, it highlights the impact of societal pressures and the ongoing navigation of just being yourself, but also resilience.
Yeah. And then Chloe's experience.
Conversely, yes. Chloe's experience as a detransitioner who felt she lacked adequate psychological support during her transition really underscores the critical need for thorough mental health assessments and consideration of various contributing factors before irreversible steps are taken.
And these individual stories really bring home the crucial point that this isn't a monolithic experience, is it?
Not at all.
There's a vast diversity of individual journeys, experiences, and outcomes within the transgender community.
Precisely. And it reinforces the idea that we really need to approach this topic with nuance and avoid making broad generalizations. Each person's story is unique.
So, okay, having navigated through the history, the science, the societal influences, individual experiences, what would you say is the most accurate answer to our initial question?
Yeah.
Is transgenderism inherently a mental health issue? Where do we land?
Based on everything we've explored, the comprehensive information, I think the most accurate conclusion is that being transgender itself is not inherently a mental disorder. This is the consensus of major medical organizations worldwide, and it's increasingly supported by research into the potential biological underpinnings of gender identity.
Right.
But it is also undeniable that transgender individuals, as a community, experience a significantly higher prevalence of mental health challenges. That's clear from the data.
Right.
And these challenges are often exacerbated and, in many cases, directly caused by external factors, societal stigma, discrimination, lack of acceptance.
And gender dysphoria itself.
Gender dysphoria, when it is present, is a recognized mental health condition that warrants appropriate clinical care. But, and this is crucial, gender dysphoria is not synonymous with being transgender. Not everyone experiences it.
So it sounds like the way forward requires us to walk a really nuanced path.
Yeah.
One that balances respect and affirmation for transgender individuals
Yes.
with a commitment to rigorous scientific inquiry into the complexities of gender identity and mental well-being.
Exactly. That sums it up well. We need to move definitively away from pathologizing transgender identities, while simultaneously acknowledging and addressing the very real mental health concerns that many transgender people experience.
And how do we do that?
Well, it necessitates continued investment in good longitudinal research, looking at long-term outcomes of care, understanding the factors contributing to disparities. It means fostering open, respectful dialogue
Yeah.
that allows for a diversity of perspectives without resorting to dehumanization. And above all, actively working to create a society where transgender individuals can live authentically, safely, and without fear of discrimination.
So ultimately, our deep dive strongly suggests that we should not view transgenderism through a solely mental health lens.
I agree.
Recognizing and validating the lived experiences of transgender individuals and actively striving towards a more inclusive and accepting society. That appears fundamental to alleviating the significant mental health burdens that many in the transgender community face.
That seems to be the most constructive path forward,
Yeah.
based on the evidence.
Okay, so after this deep exploration, here's something profound, maybe, for you to consider. Given this intricate web of biological, psychological, and societal factors we've discussed, what fundamental shifts in our collective understanding, and maybe even our societal structures, are truly necessary to ensure the mental well-being of transgender individuals and move beyond these simplistic and potentially harmful categorizations?